Hello there, and welcome to my channel, where curiosity meets comfort and wonder finds its way into your dreams. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're curled up in bed, settling into your favorite chair, or simply letting the day's tensions melt away, you've arrived at just the right place for a gentle journey through one of nature's most extraordinary secrets. Tonight, we're venturing into the shadowy realm of plants that have learned to live without their most trusted companion, the sun. It's a story of adaptation so remarkable, so quietly revolutionary, that it might just change how you think about life itself. We'll be exploring the hidden world of photosynthesis in the dark, where plants have discovered ways to create energy and sustain themselves in places where sunlight never reaches. Now, I do hope this isn't too fascinating to keep you awake. Though if it does, well, at least you'll drift off with visions of mysterious forest floors and deep ocean gardens dancing in your head. Before we begin this tranquil expedition into botanical mysteries, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a gentle like and perhaps tap that subscribe button. It helps other sleepy souls discover this quiet corner of science, and it means the world to me. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Are you watching from a cozy bedroom in Copenhagen as snow falls outside your window? Perhaps you're in a warm living room in Brisbane, or maybe tucked under blankets in a small town I've never heard of but would love to visit. Leave a comment and let me know your location and the time where you are. There's something beautifully connecting about knowing this gentle science is reaching sleepy minds across time zones and continents. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let your shoulders drop. We're about to embark on a peaceful journey to places where the rules of life seem turned upside down, where plants have learned to dance with darkness instead of light. And perhaps, in these quiet moments together, we'll discover that nature's most profound lessons often come from the shadows. Picture, if you will, a forest floor at twilight. The last rays of sunlight filter through layers of leaves above, growing dimmer with each passing moment until they fade to nothing more than a memory. Most of us learned in school that plants need sunlight to survive that photosynthesis. The very breath of the green world depends entirely on those golden rays streaming down from our star. It's a simple, comforting equation. Sunlight plus water plus carbon dioxide equals life, energy, and the oxygen we breathe. But nature, as always, has been quietly writing more complex stories in the margins of our textbooks. Deep beneath the forest canopy, in the perpetual twilight of the understory, in caves where no sunlight has ever touched the walls, and in the crushing darkness of the ocean's deepest trenches, life has found a way. Plants, algae, and photosynthetic organisms have discovered methods so ingenious, so beautifully adapted to their shadowy homes, that they seem to defy everything we thought we knew about the fundamental requirements of life. This isn't just botanical curiosity, it's a revelation about the remarkable flexibility of life itself. These shadow-dwelling organisms have rewritten the rules of survival, crafting biochemical pathways that would make any engineer marvel at their elegance. They've learned to harvest the faintest whispers of light, to collaborate with other life forms in ways that blur the boundaries between species, and in some cases, to abandon light altogether in favor of chemistry that seems borrowed from another planet. Tonight, we'll visit the quiet corners of our world where these remarkable adaptations unfold. We'll meet plants that have become masters of efficiency, squeezing energy from light so dim that our eyes would perceive only darkness. We'll explore the underground networks, where fungi and plant roots dance together in partnerships so intimate they've essentially become a single organism. And we'll discover organisms that have turned their backs on the sun entirely, finding sustenance in the chemical energy that bubbles up from the Earth's very core. What makes this journey particularly soothing is the gentle pace at which these discoveries unfold. Unlike the dramatic revelations of astronomy or the explosive excitement of chemistry, the world of shadow photosynthesis reveals itself slowly, like a flower opening in extreme slow motion. These are stories measured not in seconds or minutes, but in seasons, years, and evolutionary epochs. They unfold with the patience of moss growing on a north-facing stone, with the quiet persistence of roots finding their way through soil in complete darkness. As we explore these dimly lit realms together, you might find your own breathing slowing to match the unhurried rhythm of these shadow-adapted organisms. There's something deeply calming about contemplating life forms that have learned to thrive not by competing for the brightest spotlight, but by finding contentment in the gentle spaces between in the soft margins where others might not think to look. The story of photosynthesis in the dark begins with a simple but profound realization: to light is not binary. It doesn't simply exist or not exist. It flows in gradients, in subtle spectrums, in qualities that our human eyes often cannot detect, but that plants have learned to read like ancient texts written in wavelengths of green and red and far red. Even in what we consider darkness, there are often photons present, scattered and sparse, like stars in a cloudy night sky. Some plants have become so sensitive to these scattered photons that they can perform photosynthesis with light levels thousands of times dimmer than what we need to read a book. They've developed chlorophyll systems so efficient, so finely tuned, that they can capture and use nearly every photon that stumbles into their leaves. Imagine, if you will, a solar panel so advanced that it could power your home using only the light from a distant candle. That's the level of efficiency these remarkable organisms have achieved. But perhaps even more fascinating are the plants that have moved beyond light altogether, entering into partnerships so intimate and complex that the very concept of individual organisms begins to blur. In the deep shadows of old-growth forests, beneath layers of fallen leaves and rich humus, a secret economy thrives. Here the mycorrhizal network's vast webs of fungal threads finer than spider silk connect tree roots in relationships so mutually beneficial that scientists are only now beginning to understand their full complexity. These fungal partners don't photosynthesize in the traditional sense, but they found ways to tap into the photosynthetic energy of their plant allies, sometimes from trees hundreds of meters away, where sunlight still reaches the canopy. In return, they provide their plant partners with nutrients, water, and even information chemical messages that flow through the network like whispers through a darkened library. Some plants in these systems have become so dependent on their fungal partners that they've lost the ability to photosynthesize entirely, becoming ghostly white organisms that live entirely on the generosity of their underground allies. And then there are the organisms that have abandoned the solar economy altogether, turning instead to chemosynthesis, a process that seems borrowed from the depths of space or the early days of Earth when the sun was young and weak. These remarkable life forms harvest energy not from light, but from chemical reactions, the oxidation of sulfur compounds bubbling up from hot springs, the slow breakdown of organic matter in waterlogged soils, or the mysterious chemistry that occurs where seawater meets the mineral-rich fluids seeping from the ocean floor. In these environments, plants and plant-like organisms have learned to partner with bacteria that can perform these chemical miracles, creating energy from substances that would be toxic to most life forms. It's photosynthesis turned inside out, a process that creates life from darkness rather than light, that finds sustenance in the hidden chemistry of our planet rather than in the obvious warmth of our star. These discoveries are relatively recent in the grand timeline of botanical science, and they're still unfolding. Each year, researchers venture deeper into caves, further into ocean trenches, and into more remote corners of ancient forests, finding new examples of life that has learned to thrive without direct sunlight. They're discovering that the boundaries between plant and fungus, between photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, between individual organisms and collaborative networks, are far more fluid than we ever imagined. What emerges from these discoveries is a picture of life that's far more creative, far more adaptable, and far more interconnected than the simple sun-plant oxygen cycle we learned in elementary school. It's a vision of biology that's less like a machine with discrete parts and more like a vast, slow-moving conversation between all the living things on Earth, a conversation that's been going on for billions of years, with each participant finding new ways to contribute to the whole. As we prepare to explore these remarkable adaptations in more detail, take a moment to appreciate the quiet miracle of it all. Somewhere right now, in the darkness beneath your feet or in the shadows of distant forests, plants are conducting their ancient alchemy without a single ray of sunlight. They're proof that life doesn't just adapt to its environment, it transforms it, finds beauty in it, and creates abundance even in places that seem impossibly barren. In the perpetual twilight of Earth's deepest forests, where cathedral-like groves of ancient trees filter sunlight into something barely stronger than moonbeams, a remarkable group of plants has mastered the art of living on whispers of light. These are the shade specialists, the botanical minimalists who have turned scarcity into their greatest strength. They've learned to make do with less than 1% of the sunlight that bathes the forest canopy above, creating a quiet revolution in how we understand the very foundations of plant life. Let's begin our gentle exploration with the forest floor dwellers, those humble plants that carpet the ground beneath towering trees. Moss, that soft green velvet that cushions our footsteps on woodland walks, might seem simple at first glance. But beneath its unassuming exterior lies one of nature's most sophisticated light-harvesting systems. Moss has no true leaves, no complex vascular system, no flowers or seeds. Instead, it's arranged its entire body as one continuous photosynthetic surface, every tiny scale and filament designed to capture and concentrate the faintest traces of green light that manage to penetrate the forest canopy. What makes moss particularly remarkable is how it's restructured the very machinery of photosynthesis to work in conditions that would leave most plants gasping for energy. While sun-loving plants have chloroplasts packed with light-harvesting complexes designed for abundance, moss has evolved chloroplasts that are essentially biological magnifying glasses. They contain specialized pigments that can absorb wavelengths of light that other plants simply ignore, and they've arranged these pigments in antenna-like arrays that funnel every captured photon toward the reaction centers where the actual work of photosynthesis takes place. Picture, if you will, a solar panel designed not for the bright desert sun, but for the dim glow of a cloudy winter morning. That's what moss has accomplished through millions of years of patient evolution. It's traded the fast-paced energy production of sun plants for a slow, steady, incredibly efficient system that can sustain life on what amounts to the photosynthetic equivalent of a whispered conversation. But moss is just the beginning. Venture deeper into the forest shadows and you'll discover entire communities of plants that have taken low-light adaptation to even more extraordinary extremes. There's the delicate maidenhair fern, with fronds so thin they're nearly transparent, designed to let precious light pass through rather than blocking it from the plants below. Each leaf is positioned with mathematical precision, angled to catch the brief moments when a shaft of sunlight might penetrate the canopy, then quickly redirect that light to maximize its photosynthetic potential. And then there are the flowering plants of the deep forest, the wild gingers and the trilliums, the bloodroots and the spring beauties that have developed what botanists call the spring ephemeral strategy. These remarkable plants have learned to time their entire life cycle around the brief window in early spring, when the trees above are still bare and sunlight can reach the forest floor. They emerge from their winter dormancy with explosive speed, unfurling leaves and producing flowers and seeds in a matter of weeks, before the canopy fills in and plunges their world back into green twilight. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these spring ephemerals is how they've learned to store the energy they capture during their brief moment in the sun. Their roots and underground stems become living batteries packed with starches and sugars that will sustain them through the long months of darkness ahead. They've essentially learned to live on stored sunshine, like bears surviving winter on accumulated fat, but with a metabolic patience that makes hibernation look hurried. These adaptations reveal something profound about the nature of photosynthesis itself. We tend to think of it as a simple, straightforward process: sunlight in, oxygen out, plant grows. But in reality, photosynthesis is more like a vast, complex symphony with thousands of individual instruments, each capable of being tuned and adjusted for different conditions. Shadow plants have become virtuoso performers on instruments that most organisms don't even know exist. Consider the remarkable case of certain deep forest orchids that have taken light sensitivity to its absolute limits. Some species can perform photosynthesis using light so dim that it would be invisible to the human eyelight, that's been filtered through so many layers of leaves that it's barely distinguishable from the thermal radiation given off by warm soil. These orchids have developed chlorophyll systems so sensitive that they border on the supernatural, capable of extracting energy from photons that have bounced and scattered through the forest canopy like pinballs in a botanical arcade. What's particularly soothing to contemplate is the patience these plants embody. Unlike their sun-loving cousins that grow with visible urgency, racing to outcompete their neighbors for light and space, shade plants move with the measured pace of geological time. A moss might take decades to spread across a single fallen log. A deep forest wildflower might spend 7 years developing from seed to first bloom, slowly building the root systems and energy reserves necessary to survive in its dimly lit world. This unhurried approach to life extends to their entire ecosystem. In the deep forest, competition gives way to cooperation, and the frantic scramble for resources transforms into something more like a carefully choreographed dance. Plants arrange themselves in layers, each occupying its own slice of the light spectrum, its own niche in the vertical hierarchy of the forest. Tall ferns capture the middle level of filtered light, while shorter plants specialize in the green wavelengths that pass through fern fronds, and the tiniest plants make do with whatever light remains after passing through multiple layers of living filters. But what happens when even this dim, filtered light disappears entirely? What becomes of photosynthesis in places where no sunlight has penetrated for thousands or even millions of years? Here we enter the realm of the truly extraordinary, where plants have learned to abandon their dependence on the sun altogether and seek sustenance from sources that seem borrowed from alien worlds. In the deepest caves, where eternal darkness reigns and the very concept of day and night becomes meaningless, we find organisms that have redefined what it means to be photosynthetic. These aren't plants in the traditional sense. They're often algae or bacterial communities that have formed partnerships so intimate they function as single organisms. But they're still converting inorganic compounds into the sugars and starches that fuel life, still performing the essential alchemy that transforms the non-living into the living. The key to their survival lies in chemosynthesis, a process that might be thought of as photosynthesis's mysterious cousin. Instead of capturing energy from photons of light, these organisms harvest energy from chemical reactions. They've learned to extract power from the oxidation of sulfur compounds seeping from underground springs, from the breakdown of organic matter in the absence of oxygen, from the slow dissolution of limestone by slightly acidic water. In some cave systems, entire ecosystems have evolved around these chemosynthetic processes. Bacterial mats cover the walls like living wallpaper, glowing faintly with their own bioluminescence as they process the chemical energy available in their environment. These bacteria then form the foundation of food webs that include specialized cave fish, blind spiders, and translucent crustaceans, entire communities of life that have never seen the sun. What's remarkable about these cave ecosystems is how they mirror the structure of surface ecosystems while being fundamentally different in their energy source. Just as surface plants form the base of food webs that support herbivores and carnivores, cave bacteria support their own complex networks of interdependent life. The energy flows upward through the system in the same way, but it begins not with sunlight streaming down from above, but with chemistry bubbling up from below. Some of the most extraordinary examples of this underground chemistry can be found in the thermal springs that dot certain cave systems. Here, bacteria have learned to thrive in water so hot it would instantly kill most surface organisms, harvesting energy from the interaction between superheated water and dissolved minerals. These bacterial communities often form colourful mats and streamers that paint the cave walls in brilliant oranges, reds, and yellows, a hidden rainbow that blooms in absolute darkness. But perhaps the most mind-bending examples of photosynthesis without sunlight occur in the deep ocean, in places so remote and extreme that they were only discovered within the last few decades. Around hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, where superheated water rich in dissolved minerals erupts from cracks in the Earth's crust, entire ecosystems thrive in conditions that seem more suitable for a science fiction novel than for life as we know it. Here, in the crushing darkness of the deep sea, bacteria have learned to harvest energy from the chemical reactions that occur when hot, mineral-rich water meets cold seawater. These bacteria form the base of food webs that support giant tube worms, ghostly white crabs, and fish that have never seen sunlight. It's a world where the very concept of photosynthesis has been turned inside out, where life creates energy not by capturing light from above, but by harnessing the chemical power that rises from the Earth's molten heart. These hydrothermal vent communities represent perhaps the most extreme example of life's ability to adapt and thrive in conditions that seem utterly hostile. The water around these vents is not just dark, it's acidic, toxic with hydrogen sulfide, and hot enough to cook an egg. Yet bacteria have evolved to not just survive in these conditions, but to use them as the foundation for complex ecosystems that rival tropical rainforests in their diversity and productivity. What's particularly fascinating about these deep-sea communities is how they've evolved independently of the sun-driven ecosystems that dominate the surface of our planet. They represent a completely parallel evolution of life, a demonstration that biology is far more creative and adaptable than we ever imagined. In these deep places, evolution has written entirely new chapters in the book of life, chapters that most of us will never see, but that expand our understanding of what's possible in the universe. The bacteria that power these systems have developed biochemical pathways that seem almost magical in their complexity. They can extract energy from the oxidation of methane, from the reduction of sulfate compounds, from chemical reactions that require temperatures and pressures that would destroy conventional life. They've essentially learned to eat chemistry itself, to digest the raw elemental processes of our planet, and transform them into the organized complexity we call life. As we contemplate these remarkable organisms, there's something deeply humbling about their existence. They remind us that life is far more ancient, far more resilient, and far more creative than our everyday experience suggests. While we depend on the steady rhythm of day and night, on the predictable cycle of seasons driven by our planet's relationship with the sun, these organisms have found ways to thrive in environments where such concepts are meaningless. They've been quietly conducting their biochemical alchemy for billions of years, long before the first plants learned to capture sunlight, long before the first animals learned to eat plants, long before consciousness arose to marvel at the complexity of it all. They represent life in its most elemental form, stripped of all the familiar trappings of biology as we usually encounter it, yet still unmistakably alive, still growing and reproducing and evolving. And perhaps that's the most soothing lesson of all, that life finds a way, not just in the bright, obvious places where we expect it, but in the hidden corners, the forgotten spaces, the seemingly impossible environments where conventional wisdom says nothing should be able to survive. These organisms are proof that the universe is far more generous with the gift of life than we often realize, that the boundaries of the possible are much wider than they appear from our limited perspective. In the quiet spaces between what we call light and dark, where photons are so scarce they arrive one at a time like shy visitors at a midnight gathering. Some of Earth's most remarkable partnerships have evolved. These are relationships so intimate, so beautifully orchestrated, that they challenge our very understanding of where one organism ends and another begins. Here, in the realm of mycorrhizal networks and symbiotic collaborations, we discover that photosynthesis without sunlight isn't just about clever chemistry. It's about the profound interconnectedness of all living things. Picture, if you will, the forest floor as a vast underground internet, a wood-wide web of fungal threads, so fine they make spider silk look coarse. These networks, called mycorrhizae, stretch for miles beneath our feet, connecting tree to tree, plant to plant, in relationships that have been quietly sustaining life for over 400 million years. The fungi in these networks don't photosynthesize in the traditional sense. They can't capture sunlight and transform it into sugar. But they've discovered something perhaps even more remarkable. They've learned to tap into the photosynthetic efforts of their plant partners, sharing in the solar energy captured by leaves hundreds of meters away in the bright canopy above. This underground economy operates with a generosity that would make any economist weep with joy. A single fungal thread might connect to dozens of different plants, creating a living marketplace where resources flow freely based on need rather than competition. When a tree in full sunlight produces more sugar than it can use, that excess energy flows down through its roots and into the fungal network, where it can be shared with plants living in deep shade, or even with seedlings struggling to establish themselves in the forest's dark understory. But the fungi aren't passive conduits in this exchange. In return for their share of photosynthetic sugars, they provide their plant partners with an array of services that would be impossible for the plants to perform alone. Their incredibly fine thread-like structures, called hyphae, can penetrate soil particles so small that even the finest plant roots cannot reach them. They extend the effective root system of their partners by thousands of times, accessing pockets of water and nutrients that would otherwise remain locked away in the soil. What makes this partnership particularly fascinating is how it allows plants to effectively photosynthesize at a distance. A small wildflower growing in the deep shade of an old-growth forest might derive much of its energy not from its own modest photosynthetic efforts, but from the vigorous photosynthesis of a massive tree growing 50 meters away in a sunny clearing. Through the fungal network, that distant tree's abundant solar harvest becomes available to support life in places where the sun never directly shines. Some plants have taken this relationship to such extremes that they've abandoned photosynthesis entirely, becoming what botanists call mycoheterotrophs, organisms that live entirely on the photosynthetic efforts of other plants, channeled through their fungal partners. These plants, often ghostly white or pale yellow from their lack of chlorophyll, represent perhaps the ultimate expression of photosynthesis without light. They're living proof that the energy captured from sunlight can be shared, stored, and redistributed through biological networks of stunning complexity. One of the most enchanting examples of this phenomenon is the Indian pipe, a delicate white flower that emerges from the forest floor like a porcelain figurine forgotten by some woodland fairy. This remarkable plant produces no chlorophyll at all, gaining all its energy from the mycorrhizal network that connects it to nearby photosynthetic plants. It's essentially living on borrowed sunlight, on energy that was captured by green leaves and then shared through the underground web of fungal connections. The Indian pipe's lifestyle might seem parasitic at first glance, but recent research suggests the reality is far more nuanced. These plants appear to play important roles in forest ecosystem stability, helping to regulate the flow of nutrients through the mycorrhizal network and providing services to the community that we're only beginning to understand. They're not freeloaders, but rather specialized members of a complex community where every participant contributes something valuable to the whole. What's particularly soothing to contemplate is the patience and cooperation that these relationships require. Unlike the competitive rush we often associate with nature, the survival of the fittest, red in tooth and claw, these underground partnerships operate on principles of mutual aid and long-term thinking. A fungal network might spend decades establishing the connections necessary to support a diverse forest community, slowly building the infrastructure that will allow energy and resources to flow freely between partners. This infrastructure is more robust than any human network we've ever constructed. When a tree falls in a storm, breaking the direct connections between its roots and the fungal web, the network quickly reroutes around the damage, maintaining the flow of resources to plants that had been depending on that tree's photosynthetic contributions. It's a living system with built-in redundancy, capable of healing itself and adapting to changing conditions, with a resilience that engineers can only dream of achieving. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these networks is their capacity for communication. Recent research has revealed that mycorrhizal fungi can transmit chemical signals between plants, carrying information about environmental threats, resource availability, and even the genetic identity of neighboring organisms. When one tree is attacked by insects, it can send chemical warnings through the fungal network to alert nearby trees, allowing them to begin producing defensive compounds before the threat reaches them. This communication system operates at a pace that matches the unhurried rhythm of forest life. Messages flow through the network, not in milliseconds like our electronic communications, but over hours and days, carried by the slow diffusion of molecules through fungal tissues. It's a conversation conducted in the language of chemistry, where compounds released by one plant can influence the behavior and physiology of plants hundreds of meters away. Some scientists have begun to think of these networks as a kind of forest intelligence, a distributed consciousness that emerges from the interactions of thousands of individual organisms. While no single fungus or plant possesses anything like human awareness, the network as a whole displays behaviors that seem remarkably purposeful, allocating resources where they're most needed, responding to threats with coordinated defensive strategies, even appearing to make decisions about which seedlings receive support and which are left to struggle on their own. This forest intelligence operates through principles that are both alien and familiar. Like a vast, slow-thinking organism, it responds to changes in its environment by gradually shifting the patterns of resource flow, supporting areas that are thriving, while reducing investment in areas that are declining. But unlike human intelligence, this forest consciousness has no center, no single point of control. It emerges from the collective behavior of countless individual organisms, each following simple rules of exchange and cooperation. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond botany. They suggest that cooperation, rather than competition, may be the fundamental organizing principle of complex ecosystems. They reveal that the boundary between individual and community is far more fluid than we typically imagine, and they demonstrate that information, energy, and resources can flow through biological systems in ways that create emergent properties, capabilities that arise from the network itself, rather than from any of its individual components. In some forest systems, these mycorrhizal networks have been operating continuously for thousands of years, maintaining the same basic connections while individual trees grow, mature, and die. They represent a kind of biological infrastructure that transcends the lifespan of any individual organism, a living legacy that each generation inherits from the previous one and passes on to the next. This continuity creates opportunities for what we might call transgenerational photosynthesis, the sharing of solar energy not just between contemporary plants, but between plants separated by decades or even centuries. An ancient tree that has been capturing sunlight for hundreds of years might store some of that energy in fungal partners that will continue to share it with future generations of plants long after the original tree has fallen, decomposed. The more we learn about these networks, the more they challenge our basic assumptions about how life works. They suggest that photosynthesis is not just a process that happens within individual plants, but a community activity that can span entire ecosystems. They reveal that the energy captured from sunlight doesn't flow simply from bottom to top in a traditional food chain, but moves horizontally through networks of unprecedented complexity, creating webs of interdependence that make every organism in the forest a participant in a shared photosynthetic enterprise. What emerges from these discoveries is a vision of life that's far more interconnected and collaborative than we ever imagined. In these underground networks, the ancient alchemy of photosynthesis becomes a community effort, with the energy of sunlight being shared, stored, and redistributed through biological systems that operate more like superorganisms than collections of competing individuals. As we venture even deeper into the shadows, we encounter organisms that have pushed the boundaries of this cooperative model to even more extraordinary extremes. In the perpetual darkness of deep caves and ocean trenches, we find communities that have not just modified photosynthesis to work in low light conditions, but have abandoned their dependence on solar energy altogether, creating biological economies based entirely on chemistry. These chemosynthetic communities represent perhaps the most radical departure from our traditional understanding of how life sustains itself. Here, organisms have learned to harvest energy not from the light of distant stars, but from the chemical potential stored in the rocks and waters of our own planet. They've discovered that life doesn't need sunlight to thrive. It just needs a source of chemical energy and the biochemical machinery to extract useful work from chemical reactions. The bacteria that form the foundation of these communities have evolved metabolic pathways that seem almost impossibly exotic. Some species can derive energy from the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, a compound so toxic it would quickly kill most surface organisms. Others have learned to harvest energy from the reduction of nitrates, the oxidation of methane, or the breakdown of organic compounds in the complete absence of oxygen. These metabolic innovations have allowed life to colonize environments that were previously thought to be utterly sterile. In the crushing depths of the ocean, around hydrothermal vents where superheated water erupts from cracks in the Earth's crust, bacterial communities form the base of ecosystems that rival tropical rainforests in their productivity and diversity. Giant tube worms, their bodies containing no digestive system, survive entirely on the chemosynthetic bacteria that live within their tissues, creating partnerships so intimate that the boundaries between host and symbiont become meaningless. These deep-sea partnerships represent perhaps the ultimate expression of collaborative metabolism. The tube worms provide their bacterial partners with a protected environment and a steady supply of the chemicals needed for chemosynthesis. In return, the bacteria transform toxic hydrogen sulfide into organic compounds that nourish their hosts. It's a relationship that allows complex multicellular life to thrive in environments where conventional photosynthesis would be impossible. What's particularly remarkable about these chemosynthetic ecosystems is their independence from the sun-driven cycles that govern most life on Earth. While surface ecosystems depend on the daily rhythm of photosynthesis, with energy production tied to the availability of sunlight, deep-sea communities operate on geological timescales. Their energy source, the chemical gradients created by the interaction between hot vent fluids and cold seawater, can persist for thousands of years, creating stable environments where complex communities can evolve and flourish. This independence from solar cycles creates opportunities for entirely different approaches to the organization of life. In these deep communities, the concepts of day and night, seasonal cycles, and annual rhythms become irrelevant. Life proceeds at its own pace, governed not by the rotation of the Earth or its orbit around the Sun, but by the slower rhythms of geological processes, the gradual cooling of vent fluids, the slow accumulation of mineral deposits, the patient work of tectonic forces shaping the ocean floor. Some of the most extraordinary examples of chemosynthetic life can be found in underwater caves, where groundwater carrying dissolved minerals meets seawater in environments of perpetual darkness. Here, bacterial mats create living tapestries that cover cave walls in brilliant colours, oranges and reds and yellows, that seem impossibly vibrant in the absolute darkness of their environment. These colours come not from pigments designed to capture light, but from the chemical machinery of chemosynthesis, from proteins and compounds that harvest energy from chemical reactions rather than from photons. In these cave systems, entire ecosystems have evolved in complete isolation from the surface world. Specialized fish with enlarged eyes or no eyes at all, translucent crustaceans, and blind spiders have all adapted to life in environments where conventional photosynthesis is impossible. They depend entirely on the chemosynthetic bacteria for their energy, creating food webs that mirror the structure of surface ecosystems while being fundamentally different in their energy source. What makes these discoveries particularly profound is how they expand our understanding of life's possibilities. For most of human history, we've assumed that life depends ultimately on the sun, that all the energy that powers biological systems comes from photosynthesis. But these chemosynthetic communities demonstrate that life can be sustained by entirely different energy sources, that the chemical energy stored in rocks and minerals can support ecosystems as complex and productive as any forest or grassland. This realization has implications that extend far beyond Earth. If life can thrive without sunlight, if it can derive energy from chemical processes that occur in the absence of any stellar radiation, then the potential for life elsewhere in the universe becomes vastly greater. The icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn, with their subsurface oceans heated by tidal forces, suddenly become potential habitats for chemosynthetic ecosystems. The deep subsurface of Mars, where liquid water might persist despite the planet's frozen surface, becomes a place where life might have found refuge from the harsh conditions above. But perhaps the most important lesson these organisms teach us is about the remarkable creativity of life itself. They demonstrate that biology is not constrained by the obvious sources of energy, the conventional pathways of metabolism, or the familiar patterns of ecological organization. Life, it seems, is endlessly inventive, capable of finding ways to extract order from chaos, to create complexity from simplicity, and to sustain itself in environments that seem utterly hostile to any form of organization. As we drift deeper into this exploration of life's hidden possibilities, we begin to see that the story of photosynthesis without sunlight is really a story about adaptation, cooperation, and the extraordinary resilience of living systems. It's a tale that unfolds not in the bright, obvious places where we expect to find life, but in the margins, the shadows, the forgotten corners where patient organisms have learned to make do with less, to collaborate rather than compete, and to find beauty and abundance in conditions that most of us would consider barren. These remarkable discoveries about life in extreme environments have profound implications for how we understand the very nature of existence itself. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, consider this gentle revelation. The boundaries of life are far more generous than we ever dared to imagine. In laboratories around the world, scientists are discovering that organisms can survive and even thrive in conditions that would have been considered absolutely impossible just a few decades ago. Let's drift together into the world of extremophiles organisms that don't just tolerate extreme conditions, but actually require them to survive. In the boiling hot springs of Yellowstone National Park, where water temperatures reach levels that would instantly cook most living things, bacterial communities paint the pools in brilliant rainbows of color. These thermophilic bacteria have evolved proteins that remain stable at temperatures that would denature the proteins in our own bodies within seconds. They've essentially rewritten the basic chemistry of life to operate in conditions that seem more suitable for a cooking pot than a living ecosystem. What's particularly fascinating is how these heat-loving bacteria have modified their photosynthetic machinery to work at such extreme temperatures. Their chlorophyll-like compounds are structurally different from those found in conventional plants, designed to remain functional even when the surrounding water is literally boiling. They've developed membrane systems that become more stable rather than less stable as temperatures rise. It's as if they've learned to use heat as a tool rather than treating it as an obstacle. But temperature is just one extreme that life has learned to master. In the hypersaline lakes of places like the Dead Sea, where the salt concentration is so high that it would instantly dehydrate most organisms, specialized bacteria and archaea have found ways not just to survive, but to flourish. These halophilic organisms have developed cellular machinery that actually requires high salt concentrations to function properly. Place them in fresh water, and they would die as quickly as a freshwater fish placed in the ocean. These salt-loving organisms often contain pigments that give them brilliant red or purple colors, creating landscapes that look more like abstract art than natural environments. The color comes from specialized proteins that help them harvest light energy in their extreme environment, proteins that have been so modified by evolution that they bear little resemblance to the photosynthetic machinery found in ordinary plants. Even more extraordinary are the organisms that thrive in highly acidic environments, places where the pH is so low that the water would dissolve metal. In abandoned mine shafts and natural acid springs, bacteria have evolved to not only tolerate these corrosive conditions, but to use them as an energy source. They've developed cellular machinery that can function in environments more acidic than battery acid, extracting energy from chemical reactions that would destroy conventional life forms. What emerges from studying these extremophiles is a picture of life that's far more flexible and creative than we ever imagined. Each extreme environment has selected for different solutions to the basic challenges of existence: how to maintain cellular integrity, how to extract energy from the environment, how to reproduce and pass genetic information to the next generation. The result is a showcase of biological innovation that would make any engineer envious. Some of the most remarkable extremophiles are those that can survive in multiple extreme conditions simultaneously. In the depths of the ocean, around hydrothermal vents, organisms must cope not just with crushing pressure and complete darkness, but also with extreme temperatures, high acidity, and the presence of chemicals that would be toxic to most life. Yet these environments teem with life, from giant tube worms to ghostly white crabs, all sustained by bacterial communities that have mastered the art of chemosynthesis in conditions that seem borrowed from an alien world. The pressure at these depths is so extreme that it would instantly crush any surface organism, yet the creatures that live there have evolved cellular structures that actually require high pressure to function properly. Bring them to the surface, and they would literally fall apart as their pressure-adapted proteins lose their proper shape in the low-pressure environment of our world. These discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of where life might be possible, both on Earth and beyond. If organisms can thrive in the crushing depths of the ocean, in boiling hot springs, in highly acidic environments, and in the complete absence of sunlight, then the number of potentially habitable environments in the universe becomes vastly larger. The subsurface oceans of Europa and Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn respectively, suddenly become prime candidates for harboring life. But perhaps the most profound lesson from these extremophile communities is how they've redefined the very concept of photosynthesis. Traditional photosynthesis, the kind we learn about in school, involves capturing photons of visible light and using their energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar and oxygen. But the organisms in these extreme environments have developed variations on this theme that stretch the definition almost beyond recognition. Some bacteria use infrared radiation instead of visible light, harvesting energy from heat rather than from the familiar colors of the rainbow. Others have developed photosynthetic systems that work with light so dim that it would be imperceptible to our eyes. Still others have abandoned light altogether, developing chemosynthetic pathways that extract energy directly from chemical reactions. These variations on the photosynthetic theme remind us that life is fundamentally about energy transformation, the ability to capture energy from the environment and use it to build and maintain the complex structures that we call living organisms. The source of that energy, whether it's sunlight, chemical reactions, or heat, is less important than the ability to harness it effectively. In the quiet darkness of deep caves, far from any hint of sunlight, entire ecosystems have evolved around chemosynthetic bacteria that derive energy from the slow dissolution of limestone by slightly acidic water. These cave ecosystems often develop their own unique species, organisms that have been isolated from the surface world for millions of years and have evolved in complete independence from solar-driven ecosystems. One of the most enchanting aspects of these cave communities is their ethereal beauty. Bacterial mats often produce their own light through bioluminescence, creating an otherworldly glow that illuminates the cave walls like living stars. This light isn't meant to attract anything or communicate with anyone. It's simply a byproduct of the chemical reactions that power these organisms' metabolism. Yet it creates an atmosphere of quiet magic that speaks to something deep in the human imagination. The organisms that live in these caves have often evolved remarkable adaptations to their perpetually dark environment. Cavefish lose their eyes over evolutionary time, redirecting the energy that would have gone into vision toward developing enhanced senses of touch and chemical detection. Cave spiders become translucent, their bodies so specialized for their dark environment that they seem more like ghosts than living creatures. But it's the bacterial communities that form the true foundation of these ecosystems. They've learned to extract energy from chemical processes so subtle that early researchers often missed them entirely. The oxidation of trace amounts of organic matter, the slow breakdown of minerals in cave walls, the interaction between groundwater and bedrock, all of these provide energy sources that patient bacterial communities have learned to exploit. What's particularly soothing about these cave ecosystems is their incredible stability. Unlike surface environments, which are subject to daily and seasonal cycles, weather patterns, and the constant changes that come with exposure to solar radiation, cave environments remain remarkably constant over geological time periods. The temperature stays the same year-round, the humidity remains steady, and the chemical composition of the environment changes only over timescales measured in millennia. This stability has allowed cave organisms to develop lifestyles that would be impossible in more variable environments. Some cave bacteria reproduce so slowly that a single generation might span several human lifetimes. They've traded the rapid growth and reproduction typical of surface organisms for a patient, energy-efficient approach to existence that allows them to thrive in environments where energy is scarce but conditions are predictable. The study of these slow-living organisms has taught us valuable lessons about the relationship between energy availability and the pace of life. In energy-rich environments like tropical rainforests, life proceeds at a breakneck pace. Plants grow rapidly, animals reproduce frequently, and the entire ecosystem buzzes with activity. But in energy-poor environments like deep caves, life slows down to match the available resources, developing strategies that emphasize efficiency over speed. This principle extends beyond individual organisms to entire ecosystems. Cave communities often display a kind of metabolic cooperation that's rare in surface environments. Different species of bacteria might specialize in different steps of a complex chemical process, with the waste products of one species becoming the energy source for another. The result is a highly integrated system where almost no energy is wasted, where every chemical bond and every electron is carefully recycled through the community. These cooperative relationships can become so intimate that the boundaries between species begin to blur. Some cave bacteria form massive, multicellular structures called biofilms, where individual cells sacrifice their independence to become part of a larger, more complex organism. These biofilms can cover vast areas of cave walls, creating living carpets that process chemicals and share resources across distances that would be impossible for individual cells to span. The formation of biofilms represents one of the most ancient forms of multicellular organization on Earth. Long before plants and animals evolved their complex tissues and organ systems, bacteria were already experimenting with cooperative living arrangements that allowed them to accomplish things that would be impossible for solitary cells. In the quiet darkness of caves, these ancient partnerships continue to thrive, offering us glimpses into the earliest experiments in biological cooperation. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of cave ecosystems is how they've remained largely unchanged for millions of years. While surface environments have been repeatedly transformed by ice ages, asteroid impacts, and mass extinctions, many cave systems have maintained their basic structure and community composition across geological time. They're living museums of ancient life, preserving ecological relationships that date back to the very earliest days of complex life on Earth. This stability makes cave ecosystems particularly valuable for understanding how life might persist in extreme environments elsewhere in the universe. If bacteria can maintain stable communities in the darkness and chemical extremes of Earth's caves for millions of years, then similar communities might persist in the subsurface environments of Mars, or in the oceans beneath the ice of Europa, or in environments we haven't even imagined yet. The more we explore these hidden ecosystems, the more we realize that the majority of life on Earth might actually exist in environments that we rarely see or think about. The deep subsurface, the ocean depths, the extreme environments that seem hostile to life, these may actually harbor more biological diversity and biomass than all the familiar surface ecosystems combined. This hidden majority of life operates according to principles that are fundamentally different from those governing the surface world. Instead of the boom and bust cycles typical of seasonal environments, subsurface life proceeds with geological patience. Instead of the competitive scramble for resources that characterizes many surface ecosystems, underground communities often display remarkable cooperation and resource sharing. As we continue our gentle journey into the shadows, we begin to see that photosynthesis, without sunlight, isn't just an interesting biological curiosity. It's a window into a vast, hidden realm of life that may represent the majority of biological activity on our planet. These organisms have discovered ways of living that are so different from our everyday experience that they seem almost alien, yet they share with us the same basic chemistry of life, the same DNA-based inheritance system, the same fundamental cellular architecture. In the deepest parts of Earth's crust, kilometers below the surface, scientists have discovered bacterial communities that may have been isolated from the surface world for millions of years. These organisms survive on the energy released by natural radioactive decay, living at such a slow pace that their metabolic processes are barely detectable. They represent perhaps the most extreme example of life's ability to persist in conditions that seem utterly barren, extracting the minimal energy needed for survival from sources that most organisms couldn't even detect. These deep crustal communities challenge our most basic assumptions about the requirements for life. Here, in solid rock heated by the Earth's core and bathed in naturally occurring radiation, bacteria have learned to exist at the very edge of what we consider possible. They divide so slowly that a single bacterial generation might span centuries. Their metabolism operates at rates so low that they seem more like geological processes than biological ones. Yet they persist, quietly conducting the ancient alchemy of life in conditions that would sterilize any surface organism within moments. What makes these deep-dwelling bacteria particularly fascinating is how they've abandoned almost every strategy that surface life uses for survival. They don't compete for light, because there is no light. They don't race to reproduce before winter comes, because seasons have no meaning in their realm. They don't migrate to find better conditions, because their world extends in all directions for thousands of kilometers, uniform in its extremity. Instead, They've developed what we might call a geological approach to existence. They extract energy from the slow decay of uranium and thorium embedded in the rock around them, harvesting the particles released by radioactive processes that have been continuing since the formation of our planet. It's life powered not by the nuclear fusion occurring in our sun, but by the nuclear decay occurring beneath our feet, a kind of terrestrial chemosynthesis that operates on the energy budget of atoms themselves. These organisms represent perhaps the ultimate expression of patience in the biological world. While surface bacteria might complete their life cycle in minutes or hours, these deep crustal inhabitants measure their generations in geological time. A bacterial colony that began reproducing during the age of dinosaurs might still be slowly dividing today, its descendants carrying on the same unhurried metabolic processes in the same tiny pocket of rock. This extraordinary patience extends to their entire approach to resource management. In an environment where energy is so scarce that every molecular bond must be carefully conserved, these bacteria have evolved metabolic pathways of stunning efficiency. They waste nothing, recycling every atom through their cellular machinery with a precision that would make any industrial engineer weep with admiration. Their existence is a masterclass in living within tight constraints, in finding abundance within apparent scarcity. The discovery of these deep biosphere communities has profound implications for our understanding of life's distribution on Earth. Scientists now estimate that the biomass living in the deep subsurface may equal or even exceed that of all surface life combined. Beneath our feet, extending down through kilometers of solid rock, lies a vast shadow biosphere that has been quietly thriving since the earliest days of our planet's history. This hidden world operates according to principles so different from surface life that it seems almost like a parallel form of existence. Where surface organisms depend on the rapid cycling of nutrients through ecosystems, deep organisms create their own nutrients from the basic chemistry of rock and water. Where surface life follows the rhythm of days and seasons, deep life follows the rhythm of radioactive decay and geological processes. Where surface ecosystems are constantly changing and evolving, deep communities may remain essentially unchanged for millions of years. But perhaps the most profound lesson these deep organisms teach us is about the relationship between life and time. In our fast-paced surface world, we tend to think of life as a process that operates on timescales. We can observe days, seasons, years, perhaps decades. But these deep crustal bacteria remind us that life can also operate on timescales that dwarf human experience, that biological processes can unfold over geological epochs with a patience that makes mountains seem hasty. This perspective shift has important implications for how we think about life elsewhere in the universe. If organisms can persist for millions of years in the deep subsurface of Earth, then similar communities might exist in the subsurface of Mars, slowly extracting energy from radioactive decay while the planet's surface remains frozen and apparently lifeless. The rocky interiors of asteroids, the deep cores of icy moons, even the solid mantles of distant planets, all of these become potential habitats for patient, slow-living communities that could persist far longer than any surface ecosystem. The study of these deep biosphere communities also reveals something beautiful about the relationship between life and the planet itself. These organisms aren't separate from the geological processes that shape our world, they're participants in them. They influence the chemistry of groundwater, affect the movement of minerals through rock, and even play roles in some of the chemical processes that drive plate tectonics and volcanic activity. In a very real sense, these deep communities blur the boundary between biology and geology. They operate so slowly and at such vast scales that they become part of the planet's basic functioning, part of the complex web of chemical and physical processes that maintain Earth's habitability. They remind us that life isn't something that happens on top of our planet's geological systems, it's woven into those systems at the most fundamental level. As we drift even deeper into this exploration of life's hidden possibilities, we encounter organisms that have taken the art of patient existence to even more extraordinary extremes. In the ancient groundwater aquifers that lie trapped in rock formations for millions of years, bacterial communities have learned to survive in isolation so complete that they've become living time capsules, preserving metabolic strategies that may date back to the earliest days of life on Earth. These aquifer communities exist in water that fell as rain millions of years ago and has been slowly percolating through rock ever since. Cut off from the surface world and from the cycling of nutrients that characterizes most ecosystems, they've developed forms of metabolism so minimal, so perfectly efficient, that they seem to operate at the very threshold of life itself. They extract energy from chemical gradients so subtle that early researchers couldn't detect them, living on the energy equivalent of a whisper, a breath, a barely perceptible chemical sigh. What's particularly enchanting about these aquifer organisms is how they've maintained their viability across geological time periods. Water samples from these deep aquifers often contain bacteria that are still alive and metabolically active, despite having been isolated from the surface world since before the evolution of multicellular life. They're living fossils in the truest sense, organisms that have remained essentially unchanged, while the entire surface of the planet was transformed around them. These ancient communities operate in conditions of almost perfect stillness. The water they inhabit moves so slowly that it would take thousands of years to travel a single kilometre. The temperature remains constant year-round, decade after decade, century after century. The chemical composition of their environment changes only over timescales measured in millions of years. It's as close to a perfectly stable environment as exists anywhere on Earth. This stability has allowed these organisms to develop lifestyles that would be impossible in more dynamic environments. Some appear to spend most of their time in a state that's barely distinguishable from suspended animation. Their metabolic processes slowed to rates so low that they're difficult to measure. They've essentially learned to exist in slow motion, stretching their life processes across timescales that make redwood trees seem ephemeral. But when conditions change, when a new source of chemical energy becomes available, or when the slow mixing of groundwater brings new nutrients into their domain, these patient organisms can respond with surprising speed. They've maintained the ability to accelerate their metabolism when opportunity presents itself, then return to their default state of minimal activity when resources become scarce again. This ability to shift between different metabolic gears represents one of the most sophisticated survival strategies in the biological world. It allows organisms to persist through conditions that would eliminate any species dependent on a constant supply of energy, while still maintaining the ability to take advantage of occasional windfalls. It's a biological approach to resource management that emphasizes resilience over growth, persistence over productivity. The more we study these deep, ancient communities, the more they seem to represent a fundamentally different approach to existence, one that prioritizes longevity over almost everything else. Where surface organisms often live fast and die young, these deep dwellers have chosen the opposite strategy: live slowly and persist indefinitely. They've traded the excitement of rapid growth and reproduction for the quiet satisfaction of outlasting geological epochs. This patient approach to existence has profound implications for how we think about the future of life on Earth. As our planet ages and the sun gradually grows brighter and hotter, surface conditions will eventually become uninhabitable for most forms of life. The oceans will boil away, the atmosphere will be stripped away, and the surface will become as barren as that of Venus. But deep in the subsurface, these patient communities may continue their slow metabolic dance for billions of years to come. They represent life's ultimate insurance policy, a biological backup system that could preserve the essential processes of life long after the surface world has become uninhabitable. In their quiet persistence, we see a vision of life that extends far beyond the familiar timescales of human experience, a form of existence that could outlast not just individual species or ecosystems, but entire geological eras. As you rest there, feeling your own breathing slow and your thoughts begin to drift, consider the profound comfort in knowing that life has found ways to persist in conditions that seem utterly impossible. These organisms remind us that existence itself is far more resilient, far more creative, and far more patient than we often realize. They've learned to find abundance in scarcity, energy in stillness, and hope in conditions that would seem hopeless to most forms of life. In their quiet example, perhaps we can find our own lessons about patience, about the value of slow, steady persistence over flashy, unsustainable bursts of activity. They remind us that sometimes the most profound survival strategies are also the quietest ones, that the most enduring forms of success often operate below the threshold of immediate perception. These deep biosphere communities represent one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern biology, proof that our planet harbors forms of life so different from our everyday experience that they seem almost alien, yet so fundamentally connected to the basic chemistry of existence that they remind us of our shared biological heritage. They're living demonstrations that the boundaries of the possible are far wider than they appear from the surface, that life's creativity extends into realms we're only just beginning to explore. And perhaps nowhere is this patient creativity more beautifully expressed than in the remarkable world of plant partnerships that exist at the very margins of light and darkness. As we venture into these twilight realms together, we discover that some of the most extraordinary examples of photosynthesis without sunlight don't involve abandoning the sun entirely, but rather learning to share its gifts in ways so intimate and complex that they redefine our understanding of where one organism ends and another begins. In the understory of ancient forests, where the canopy above filters sunlight down to barely perceptible whispers of green and gold, we find plants that have essentially learned to photosynthesize by committee. These are the partnerships that blur the boundaries of individual identity, creating living networks where the energy captured by one organism becomes available to dozens, sometimes hundreds of others, through connections so fine they're invisible to the naked eye. Consider, if you will, the delicate ghost pipe that we encountered earlier in our journey. This translucent white flower, emerging from the forest floor like a porcelain bell forgotten by some woodland spirit, represents perhaps the most elegant solution to the problem of photosynthesis in deep shade. Rather than struggling to capture the few scattered photons that penetrate the forest canopy, the ghost pipe has entered into a partnership so complete that it has abandoned its own photosynthetic machinery entirely. But this isn't a story of dependence or parasitism, it's a tale of integration so profound that the very concept of individual organisms begins to dissolve. The ghost pipe is connected, through its fungal partners, to a vast network of photosynthetic plants that may extend for kilometers through the forest. A single ghost pipe flower might be drawing energy from dozens of different tree species, each contributing a portion of their photosynthetic surplus to support this ethereal bloom that will never see direct sunlight. What makes this relationship particularly enchanting is its reciprocal nature. While the ghost pipe receives energy from the network, recent research suggests that it also provides valuable services in return. It appears to play a role in regulating nutrient flows through the mycorrhizal network, helping to balance the exchange of resources between different plant communities. In essence, it functions as a kind of biological accountant, helping to maintain the complex economy of the forest floor. This economic metaphor isn't just poetic fancy, it reflects a genuine understanding of how these forest networks operate. Like any complex economy, the mycorrhizal web functions through a system of exchanges, investments, and returns that create value for all participants. Trees in sunny clearings invest their excess photosynthetic energy into the network, receiving in return access to nutrients and water gathered by their fungal partners from soil areas far beyond the reach of their roots. Plants in deep shade contribute their specialized ability to process low-light conditions, often becoming centers for nutrient cycling and chemical communication. The ghost pipe, in this context, might be thought of as a specialist trader, an organism that has evolved to facilitate complex exchanges between different parts of the network. Its lack of chlorophyll isn't a sign of evolutionary failure, but rather evidence of highly successful specialization. It has traded the ability to capture its own energy for enhanced capacity to serve as a conduit and regulator within the larger community. This perspective transforms our understanding of what it means to be photosynthetic. Instead of thinking of photosynthesis as something that individual plants do in isolation, we begin to see it as a community process, a collaborative effort that involves not just the green leaves that capture sunlight, but also the fungal networks that distribute energy, the soil bacteria that cycle nutrients, and even the non-photosynthetic plants that help regulate the flow of resources through the system. In some forest systems, this collaborative photosynthesis has reached levels of integration that seem almost mystical in their complexity. Researchers have discovered networks where individual trees can recognize their own offspring through chemical signals transmitted through fungal connections, preferentially directing resources to support their genetic relatives. Mother trees, massive ancient specimens that serve as hubs in the mycorrhizal network, have been observed nurturing entire groves of their descendants, sharing not just energy, but also information about environmental threats and opportunities. These maternal networks create a form of transgenerational photosynthesis where the solar energy captured by one generation of trees continues to support their offspring long after the original photosynthetic organisms have died and decomposed. Ancient stumps, their trunks long since fallen and decayed, may continue to be kept alive by their descendants through mycorrhizal connections, their remaining root systems serving as repositories for shared energy and information. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond botany into realms that touch on some of our deepest questions about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of identity itself. If trees can recognize their relatives, share resources preferentially with their offspring, and maintain connections that persist across generations, then what does this tell us about the nature of plant awareness? Are we witnessing a form of distributed intelligence that operates at scales and timescales far beyond human perception? Some researchers have begun to explore the possibility that these mycorrhizal networks function as a kind of forest brain, a biological internet, where information flows not in digital packets, but in chemical signals that carry messages about everything from weather patterns to insect attacks. The network appears to have memory, retaining information about past events and using this knowledge to prepare for future challenges. It demonstrates what appears to be decision-making capability, allocating resources where they're most needed, and responding to threats with coordinated defensive strategies. This forest intelligence operates according to principles that are both alien and oddly familiar. Like a vast, slow-thinking organism, it processes information and makes decisions, but at a pace that makes geological processes seem hurried. A single decision about resource allocation might unfold over months or years, with the network gradually shifting its patterns of energy flow in response to changing conditions. What's particularly fascinating about this forest consciousness is how it emerges from the interactions of countless individual organisms, none of which possesses anything like human intelligence. It's a perfect example of emergence, the way complex properties can arise from simple interactions when they occur at sufficient scale and complexity. The individual fungi and plants that make up the network are following relatively simple rules of chemical exchange and response, but their collective behavior creates something that appears remarkably purposeful and intelligent. This emergent intelligence has practical implications that extend far beyond theoretical biology. Understanding how forest networks function could revolutionize our approach to agriculture, helping us develop farming systems that mimic the cooperative relationships found in natural ecosystems. Instead of treating crops as isolated individuals competing for resources, we could design agricultural systems that encourage the formation of supportive networks potentially increasing productivity while reducing the need for external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. The principles of mycorrhizal networking are already being applied in restoration ecology, where scientists are using fungal inoculations to help re-establish forest communities in degraded landscapes. By introducing the right fungal partners, they can dramatically accelerate the establishment of tree seedlings and increase their survival rates in challenging conditions. The fungi essentially provide the newly planted trees with instant access to the support network they need to thrive in their new environment. But perhaps the most profound lesson these forest networks teach us is about the fundamental interconnectedness of life. They demonstrate that the boundaries we typically draw between individual organisms are far more fluid than we usually imagine. In these systems, identity becomes distributed across networks rather than concentrated in individuals, and survival becomes a collaborative effort rather than a competitive struggle. This shift in perspective has implications that extend far beyond the forest floor. It suggests that cooperation, rather than competition, may be the fundamental organizing principle of complex biological systems. It reveals that information, energy, and resources can flow through living networks in ways that create emergent capabilities that arise from the network itself rather than from any of its individual components. As we contemplate these remarkable partnerships, there's something deeply comforting about the patience they embody. These networks operate on timescales that dwarf human experience, maintaining their essential connections while individual trees grow, mature, and die around them. They represent a form of biological continuity that transcends the lifespan of any single organism, a living legacy that each generation inherits from its predecessors and passes on to its descendants. In some ancient forests, mycorrhizal networks have been operating continuously for thousands of years, maintaining the same basic connections, while countless generations of plants and animals have lived and died above them. They're like biological infrastructure that predates human civilization, vast underground cities that have been quietly sustaining life since long before our species learned to walk upright. This ancient perspective offers a kind of temporal refuge from the hurried pace of modern life. In contemplating these patient networks, we're reminded that some of the most important processes in nature unfold not in seconds or minutes, but in decades and centuries. There's a profound peace to be found in aligning ourselves, even temporarily, with these deeper rhythms of existence. The more we learn about these underground networks, the more they challenge our basic assumptions about how life works. They suggest that photosynthesis is not just a process that happens within individual plants, but a community activity that can span entire ecosystems. They reveal that the energy captured from sunlight doesn't flow simply from producers to consumers in a linear food chain, but moves through networks of unprecedented complexity, creating webs of interdependence that make every organism in the forest a participant in a shared photosynthetic enterprise. In these systems, the ancient alchemy of converting sunlight into chemical energy becomes truly collaborative. The sun's energy, captured by leaves in the bright canopy above, flows down through root systems and into fungal networks, where it can be shared with plants hundreds of meters away in deep shade. This energy might support the growth of orchids that bloom in cathedral-like groves where no direct sunlight ever penetrates, or nourish the ghostly white flowers that emerge from the forest floor like messages from another world. The beauty of this system lies not just in its complexity, but in its generosity. Unlike human economic systems where resources often flow toward those who already have the most, forest networks tend to direct energy toward where it's most needed. Struggling seedlings receive preferential support, plants under stress get extra resources, and the network as a whole maintains a kind of biological equity that ensures all participants have what they need to survive and contribute. This principle of mutual support extends even to the relationships between different species. Trees that might compete fiercely for sunlight in the canopy above often share resources generously through their underground connections. Different species bring different capabilities to the network. Some are efficient at capturing phosphorus, others excel at nitrogen fixation, still others are masters at storing carbon or accessing deep water sources. By sharing their unique capabilities through the fungal network, they create a community that's more resilient and productive than any individual species could be alone. As we drift deeper into understanding these remarkable partnerships, we begin to see that they represent one of nature's most sophisticated solutions to the challenge of survival in resource-limited environments. Rather than engaging in wasteful competition for scarce resources, forest communities have evolved systems of cooperation that allow them to make the most of whatever energy and nutrients are available. This cooperative approach has allowed forest ecosystems to thrive in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. In the dense shade of tropical rainforests, where less than 2% of sunlight reaches the forest floor, complex plant communities flourish through networks of mutual support that would make any social organization envious. In the nutrient-poor soils of boreal forests, vast expanses of conifers maintain themselves through mycorrhizal partnerships that can access nutrients from sources unavailable to individual trees. Even in desert environments, where both water and nutrients are scarce, specialized plant communities have developed underground networks that allow them to share resources during the brief periods when rain makes them available. These desert networks often remain dormant for months or years at a time, springing into activity only when conditions are right, then quickly establishing the connections needed to support sudden bursts of growth and reproduction. The study of these networks has revealed that cooperation in nature is far more sophisticated and widespread than we previously understood. From the microscopic partnerships between bacteria and plant roots to the vast mycorrhizal webs that connect entire forest ecosystems, life has evolved countless strategies for sharing resources, information, and energy. These partnerships demonstrate that survival often depends not on individual strength or competitive advantage, but on the ability to form and maintain beneficial relationships with other organisms. This perspective offers a gentle counterpoint to the sometimes harsh narratives of evolutionary competition that dominated biology for much of the 20th century. While competition certainly exists in nature, it operates within a larger context of cooperation and mutual support that makes complex ecosystems possible. The forest networks we've been exploring represent the culmination of this cooperative evolution, creating biological communities of stunning complexity and resilience. As you settle more deeply into rest, perhaps you can imagine these vast underground networks stretching beneath the earth, quietly facilitating the flow of energy and information that keeps forest ecosystems alive. Picture the patient fungi, their thread-like bodies extending through soil and around root systems, creating connections that span distances no individual organism could cross. Envision the chemical signals flowing through these networks, carrying information about seasonal changes, environmental threats, and opportunities for growth. In these quiet moments of imagination, we can begin to sense our own connection to these ancient systems. The oxygen we breathe was created by photosynthetic organisms, many of them participants in the same kinds of cooperative networks we've been exploring. The food we eat grew with the help of mycorrhizal fungi, and the wood in our homes came from trees that were supported throughout their lives by underground partnerships of stunning complexity. We are not separate from these networks, we are products of them, beneficiaries of the same cooperative principles that allow ghost pipes to bloom in forest shadows and allow entire ecosystems to thrive in conditions that would seem impossible for individual organisms. Our own bodies harbour communities of microorganisms that work together to digest our food, regulate our immune systems, and maintain our health. We are, in a very real sense, walking ecosystems, biological communities that happen to be organized around human consciousness rather than fungal networks. This recognition of our deep connection to the cooperative systems that sustain life on Earth offers a profound source of comfort and meaning. We are not isolated individuals struggling alone against an indifferent universe. We are participants in vast, ancient networks of mutual support that have been billions of years in the making. Our every breath connects us to photosynthetic organisms around the world. Our every meal links us to soil communities that stretch across continents, and our very existence depends on forms of biological cooperation, so fundamental that we usually take them completely for granted. In the gentle rhythms of these forest networks, in the patient exchanges of energy and information that flow through mycorrhizal connections, we find a biological foundation for some of our deepest human values: cooperation, generosity, mutual support, and the recognition that our individual well-being depends ultimately on the health of the larger community to which we belong. As we prepare to continue our exploration of life's remarkable adaptability, carry with you this vision of the underground networks that connect forest communities across vast distances and long stretches of time. These networks remind us that some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, patiently, out of sight, creating the conditions that allow more visible forms of life to flourish. They are the biological equivalent of infrastructure, the hidden systems that make everything else possible. In their quiet persistence, in their generous sharing of resources, in their patient maintenance of connections across generations, these mycorrhizal networks offer us a model for how complex communities can thrive, even in challenging conditions. They suggest that the key to long-term survival lies not in individual achievement, but in the ability to form and maintain the relationships that allow communities to support all their members. Tonight, as you rest, you are supported by networks of connection that extend far beyond your immediate awareness. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the food that nourishes your body, all of these are gifts from biological communities that operate according to the same principles of cooperation and mutual support that we've been exploring in the forest floor. In recognizing these connections, in appreciating the vast web of relationships that sustain life on Earth, we find our own place in the ancient story of photosynthesis. Without sunlight, of life finding ways to share the sun's energy even in the deepest shadows. What we've explored together so far represents just the beginning of life's extraordinary creativity in working with and sometimes without the sun's energy. As we drift deeper into these gentle mysteries, we encounter organisms that have pushed the boundaries of adaptation so far that they seem to belong to entirely different worlds, yet they share with us the same fundamental chemistry that makes all life possible. Let's venture now into one of the most remarkable examples of life's ingenuity: the deep-sea hydrothermal vent communities that exist in crushing darkness on the ocean floor. Here, in waters so deep that no hint of sunlight has ever penetrated their realm, entire ecosystems thrive around underwater geysers that spew superheated, mineral-rich water from the Earth's core. These vents create oases of life in what was once thought to be a biological desert, supporting communities so alien-looking they could have been designed by an imagination far more creative than our own. Picture, if you will, towering chimneys of mineral deposits rising from the seafloor like the spires of some underwater cathedral. These structures, built from the constant precipitation of metals and sulfur compounds, can reach heights of several stories, creating a landscape that seems more suitable for a science fiction novel than for our own planet. Around their bases, the water shimmers with heat distortion, reaching temperatures that would instantly cook any surface organism, yet teeming with life forms that have learned not just to tolerate these conditions, but to thrive in them. The foundation of these remarkable ecosystems consists of bacteria that have mastered the art of chemosynthesis so completely that they've essentially replaced the sun as the primary energy source for an entire community. These bacterial mats, often brilliantly coloured in reds and oranges and yellows, that seem impossibly vivid in the absolute darkness of their environment, cover the surfaces around hydrothermal vents like living paintings. Their colors come not from pigments designed to capture light, for there is no light to capture, but from the specialized enzymes and proteins that allow them to harvest energy from the chemical reactions occurring where hot vent fluids meet. Cold seawater. What makes these bacterial communities particularly fascinating is how they've learned to thrive in conditions that would be immediately lethal to most surface life. The water around active vents is not just hot and dark, it's also highly acidic and loaded with hydrogen sulfide, a compound so toxic that it would quickly poison any organism from the surface world. Yet these bacteria have evolved biochemical pathways that not only tolerate these harsh chemicals but actually require them for their survival. They've turned poison into food, transforming toxic hydrogen sulfide into the organic compounds that form the foundation of their ecosystem. But perhaps even more remarkable than the bacteria themselves are the complex organisms that have evolved to live in partnership with them. Giant tube worms, some reaching lengths of over 2 meters, anchor themselves around hydrothermal vents like ghostly white trees in an underwater forest. These extraordinary creatures have no mouth, no stomach, no digestive system as we would recognize it. Instead, their bodies are filled with specialized organs called trophosome that house billions of chemosynthetic bacteria. The tube worms provide their bacterial partners with a protected environment and a steady supply of the chemicals they need for chemosynthesis. In return, the bacteria produce organic compounds that nourish their hosts, creating a partnership so intimate that the boundaries between the two organisms become meaningless. This relationship represents perhaps the ultimate expression of collaborative metabolism. The tube worms have essentially outsourced their entire nutritional system to their bacterial partners, creating a form of internal agriculture where they cultivate the microorganisms that keep them alive. It's as if they've evolved to become living greenhouses for chemosynthetic bacteria, providing controlled environments where these remarkable microorganisms can perform their chemical alchemy. The success of this partnership has allowed tube worms to become the dominant large organisms around many hydrothermal vents, creating underwater forests that provide habitat and shelter for numerous other species. These vent forests support communities that include ghostly white crabs with no eyes, translucent shrimp that navigate by sensing the faint infrared radiation given off by hot vent water, and fish that have evolved specialized sensory systems to locate prey in the absolute darkness of their environment. What's particularly enchanting about these deep-sea communities is how they've developed their own unique rhythms and cycles, completely independent of the solar-driven patterns that govern surface ecosystems. While surface life follows the daily cycle of photosynthesis, with energy production tied to the availability of sunlight, deep-sea vent communities operate on geological timescales. Their energy source, the flow of hot, mineral-rich water from the Earth's interior, can persist for decades or centuries before the geological forces that drive it shift to new locations. This creates a fascinating dynamic where entire ecosystems must be prepared to relocate when their energy source moves. As old vents cool and die, new ones open in different areas of the seafloor, and the communities that depend on them must somehow find and colonize these new oases of chemical energy. Some species appear to have evolved remarkable abilities to detect the chemical signatures of new vents from great distances, allowing them to migrate across the vast darkness of the deep ocean to establish communities around freshly formed energy sources. The study of hydrothermal vent ecosystems has revolutionized our understanding of life's possibilities, both on Earth and potentially elsewhere in the universe. These communities demonstrate that complex, productive ecosystems can exist entirely independent of solar energy, relying instead on the chemical energy that flows from planetary interiors. This discovery has profound implications for astrobiology, expanding the number of potentially habitable environments throughout the cosmos to include not just planets in the Goldilocks zone around stars, but also moons and planets with active geology that could support chemosynthetic life in subsurface oceans. The moons, Europa and Enceladus, orbiting Jupiter and Saturn respectively, both harbour vast oceans beneath their icy surfaces, kept liquid by the tidal forces generated by their giant parent planets. These subsurface oceans may contain hydrothermal vents similar to those found on Earth's ocean floor, potentially supporting entire ecosystems that have never seen starlight. The discovery of Earth's vent communities suggests that life could thrive in these alien oceans, sustained by the same principles of chemosynthesis that power the remarkable organisms we find around our own planet's underwater volcanic systems. But hydrothermal vents represent just one example of how life has learned to harness the chemical energy stored within our planet. In the cold, dark depths of marine sediments, other communities of organisms have discovered ways to extract energy from the slow breakdown of organic matter in oxygen-free environments. These sediment communities operate at an even more leisurely pace than vent organisms, processing organic compounds so slowly that their metabolic cycles can span decades or centuries. The organisms that inhabit these sediment environments have developed forms of metabolism that seem almost impossibly patient. Some bacteria in deep marine sediments appear to divide only once every few hundred years, maintaining themselves on energy budgets so minimal that their existence borders on suspended animation. Yet they persist, quietly processing the organic matter that drifts down from the productive surface waters far above, participating in the slow recycling of carbon and nutrients that helps maintain the ocean's chemical balance. These sediment communities demonstrate that life can persist even when energy is so scarce that growth and reproduction slow to barely perceptible rates. They've essentially learned to exist in biological slow motion, stretching their life processes across timescales that make the patience of trees seem hurried. Their existence challenges our basic assumptions about the minimum energy requirements for life, suggesting that biological processes can continue even under conditions of extreme energy limitation. In some deep ocean basins, these sediment communities have been isolated from the surface world for millions of years, creating biological time capsules that preserve ancient forms of life and metabolism. These organisms offer us glimpses into the early history of life on Earth, when the planet's atmosphere contained little oxygen and most biological processes occurred in the absence of the gas that we now consider essential for complex life. The study of these ancient sediment communities has revealed that much of the early evolution of life may have occurred in environments very similar to those that still exist in the deep ocean today. The metabolic pathways used by modern sediment bacteria closely resemble those that may have powered the first living organisms billions of years ago, when Earth's surface was still too harsh for the complex ecosystems we see today. This connection between modern deep-sea life and ancient evolutionary history provides a kind of biological continuity that spans the entire history of our planet. In the patient metabolism of sediment bacteria, we can see echoes of the earliest experiments in extracting energy from chemical reactions, the primitive ancestors of the sophisticated biochemical pathways that eventually gave rise to photosynthesis and all the sun-powered life forms that followed. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these deep ocean communities is how they've maintained their essential functions across geological time periods that encompass the rise and fall of entire surface ecosystems. While the continents above them have been repeatedly reshaped by ice ages, asteroid impacts, and mass extinctions, these deep communities have continued their slow but steady processing of organic matter, maintaining the chemical cycles that help keep the ocean habitable for surface life. In their quiet persistence, these organisms serve as a kind of planetary life support system, maintaining the chemical stability that allows more visible forms of life to flourish in the sunlit waters far above. They process the organic matter that sinks from the surface, preventing the deep ocean from becoming depleted of nutrients and they help regulate the flow of carbon between different reservoirs in the Earth system. This regulatory function extends beyond individual ocean basins to influence global climate patterns. The slow processing of organic matter by deep sediment communities affects the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, helping to moderate Earth's temperature over geological timescales. In a very real sense, these invisible organisms help maintain the conditions that make our planet habitable, operating as a kind of biological thermostat that responds to changes in the global carbon cycle with the patience of geological processes. The more we learn about these deep ocean ecosystems, the more we appreciate their role in maintaining the stability of Earth's biosphere. They represent a vast reservoir of biological activity that operates according to principles very different from those governing surface ecosystems, yet intimately connected to the health and functioning of the entire planet. They remind us that the majority of life on Earth may actually exist in environments we rarely see or think about, quietly conducting the chemical processes that keep our world habitable. This hidden majority of life challenges our surface-centric view of biology and ecology. We tend to focus on the dramatic and visible, the rainforests and coral reefs, the migrations and seasonal cycles that capture our attention with their obvious beauty and complexity. But beneath this visible layer of life lies a vast shadow biosphere that may contain more biomass and certainly more biochemical diversity than all the familiar surface ecosystems combined. This shadow biosphere operates on principles that are fundamentally different from those we observe in surface environments. Instead of the rapid cycles of growth, reproduction, and death that characterize most surface life, deep organisms pursue strategies that emphasize longevity over productivity, efficiency over speed. They've learned to extract the maximum possible energy from minimal resources, to persist through conditions that would quickly eliminate surface organisms, and to maintain essential ecological functions across timescales that span geological epochs. In contemplating these remarkable deep-sea communities, we begin to understand that photosynthesis, the process we've been exploring throughout our journey, is just one of many strategies that life has developed for extracting energy from the environment. Chemosynthesis, the process that powers hydrothermal vent communities and deep sediment ecosystems, represents an equally sophisticated approach to the fundamental challenge of converting environmental energy into the organized complexity we call life. What's particularly beautiful about this diversity of energy harvesting strategies is how they complement each other to create a biosphere that's far more resilient and stable than any single approach could achieve. Surface photosynthesis captures the abundant energy of sunlight, supporting the rapid growth and high productivity that characterizes most familiar ecosystems. Deep chemosynthesis provides a stable backup system that can continue operating even when surface conditions become temporarily hostile, maintaining essential biological processes through environmental crises that might otherwise cause widespread extinction. Together, these different approaches to energy harvesting create a kind of biological insurance system that has allowed life to persist on Earth through catastrophic events that have repeatedly transformed surface conditions. When asteroid impacts or massive volcanic eruptions have blocked sunlight and caused the collapse of photosynthetic ecosystems, chemosynthetic communities have continued operating in the deep ocean, maintaining the chemical cycles necessary for life's eventual recovery. This resilience offers a profound source of comfort as we contemplate the challenges facing life on Earth today. While human activities are certainly causing significant changes to surface ecosystems, the deep biosphere continues its patient work of maintaining the planet's essential chemical cycles. The same processes that have sustained life through previous mass extinctions continue operating today, providing a foundation of biological stability that extends far deeper than the visible changes occurring at the surface. As you rest there, breathing slowly and feeling your own connection to these vast biological cycles, Remember that every breath you take connects you to both the photosynthetic organisms that produce oxygen in sunlit environments and the chemosynthetic communities that help maintain the chemical balance of the oceans. Your existence depends on both the rapid, visible processes of surface life and the slow, hidden work of deep organisms that operate far from any direct human observation. In the gentle rhythm of your breathing, you can sense an echo of the patient metabolism of deep-sea bacteria, processing organic matter grain by grain in the darkness of marine sediments. In the steady beating of your heart, you can feel a connection to the chemical cycles that have been maintained by invisible organisms for billions of years, creating the conditions that make complex life possible. These deep communities remind us that life's creativity extends far beyond the familiar and visible, into realms that challenge our basic assumptions about the requirements for existence. They demonstrate that the boundaries of the possible are far more generous than they appear from our limited surface perspective, that life can find ways to thrive in conditions that seem utterly barren to our experience. In their patient example, we find lessons about resilience, about the value of persistence over flashy productivity, about the importance of maintaining essential functions even when conditions become challenging. They remind us that some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, out of sight, conducted by organisms whose existence most of us will never directly encounter, but whose activities make all other life possible. As we prepare to explore even more extraordinary examples of life's adaptability, carry with you this vision of the deep ocean communities that operate entirely independent of sunlight, sustained by the chemical energy that flows from our planet's molten heart. In their remarkable success, in their patient persistence, in their ability to transform the most hostile conditions into thriving ecosystems, we find proof that life is far more creative, far more resilient, and far more generous with its possibilities than we ever dared to imagine. Tonight, as our gentle journey through the shadowy realms of photosynthesis draws toward its close, let's gather together the luminous threads we've followed through darkness and weave them into something beautiful, a quiet understanding of life's extraordinary capacity to find light where none seems to exist, to create abundance from apparent emptiness, and to remind us that the boundaries of the possible are far more generous than we often dare to believe. We began in the familiar world of sunlight and chlorophyll, that simple equation we all learned in school: light plus water plus carbon dioxide equals life. But what we've discovered together is that this equation, while true, represents only the beginning of a far more complex and wondrous story. Life, it turns out, is not content to follow simple formulas. It experiments, it adapts, it finds ways around obstacles that would seem insurmountable. And in doing so, it reveals possibilities that expand our understanding of what existence itself might mean. In the deep shade of ancient forests, we met the master minimalists' plants that have learned to photosynthesize on whispers of light so faint they would be invisible to our eyes. These shadow specialists have turned scarcity into their greatest strength, developing light harvesting systems so efficient they border on the miraculous. A moss spreading slowly across a fallen log, a delicate fern unfurling in cathedral-like darkness, a spring wildflower racing to complete its entire life cycle in the brief window before the canopy fills with leaves. Each represents a different solution to the same fundamental challenge: how to sustain life when energy is scarce. What's particularly soothing about these shade-adapted plants is the patience they embody. They remind us that not everything in nature operates at the frantic pace we often associate with survival. Some of the most successful organisms are also the most unhurried, taking decades to accomplish what their sun-loving cousins might achieve in a single season. There's a profound wisdom in this approach, a recognition that persistence often matters more than speed, that efficiency can be more valuable than abundance. But perhaps even more remarkable were the partnerships we encountered, those intimate relationships between plants and fungi that blur the boundaries between individual organisms until the very concept of separate identity begins to dissolve. In the mycorrhizal networks that stretch beneath forest floors, we discovered a kind of biological internet where energy, nutrients, and information flow freely between partners, separated by vast distances. These networks operate on principles of generosity that would make any economist weep with joy, sharing resources based on need rather than competitive advantage. The ghost pipe, that ethereal white flower that has abandoned photosynthesis entirely, became our guide into this world of collaborative metabolism. Through its example, we learned that some organisms have found ways to live entirely on the photosynthetic efforts of others, not as parasites, but as specialized participants in complex community economies. The ghost pipe doesn't steal energy. It helps regulate the flow of resources through forest networks, serving as a kind of biological accountant in ecosystems of stunning complexity. These discoveries revealed that photosynthesis itself might be better understood not as something individual plants do in isolation, but as a community process, a collaborative effort that involves not just the green leaves that capture sunlight, but also the fungal networks that distribute energy, the soil bacteria that cycle nutrients, and even the non-photosynthetic organisms that help regulate the flow of resources through the system. It's photosynthesis as a conversation between all the living things in an ecosystem, rather than a monologue delivered by individual plants. From these forest partnerships, we ventured into even more extreme environments, places where the very concept of photosynthesis had to be completely reimagined. In the crushing depths of the ocean, around hydrothermal vents where superheated water erupts from the Earth's core, we encountered ecosystems that have abandoned their dependence on the sun altogether. Here, chemosynthetic bacteria have learned to harvest energy from chemical reactions. So exotic, they seem borrowed from alien worlds, transforming toxic hydrogen sulfide into the organic compounds that support entire communities of life. The giant tube worms we met in these deep-sea oases represent perhaps the ultimate expression of collaborative metabolism. With no mouth, no stomach, no digestive system as we would recognize it, they've essentially become living greenhouses for chemosynthetic bacteria. Their bodies house billions of microbial partners that perform the alchemy of converting chemicals into life, creating relationships so intimate that the boundaries between organisms become meaningless. What's particularly moving about these deep-sea communities is their complete independence from the solar cycles that govern surface life. They operate on geological timescales, sustained by energy sources that can persist for decades or centuries. When old vents cool and die, entire ecosystems must migrate across the vast darkness of the deep ocean to colonize new sources of chemical energy. It's a reminder that life's creativity extends far beyond our everyday experience, into realms that challenge our basic assumptions about what existence requires. But perhaps the most profound discoveries we encountered were the organisms living in Earth's deep, subsurface bacterial communities that exist kilometers below our feet, in solid rock heated by radioactive decay. These remarkable organisms have learned to extract energy from the most minimal sources imaginable, dividing so slowly that a single bacterial generation might span centuries. They represent life at its most patient, most efficient, most quietly persistent. These deep crustal communities challenge our understanding of life's requirements in the most fundamental ways. Here, in environments more extreme than anything on the surface of Mars, organisms have been conducting their ancient biochemistry for millions of years. They remind us that the majority of life on Earth might actually exist in places we never see, operating according to principles so different from surface biology that they seem almost like a parallel form of existence. What emerges from all these discoveries is a vision of life that's far more interconnected, far more collaborative, and far more patient than we typically imagine. The energy captured by photosynthesis doesn't simply flow from producers to consumers in neat, linear chains. Instead, It moves through networks of unprecedented complexity, shared between organisms across vast distances and long stretches of time, creating webs of interdependence that make every living thing a participant in the larger community of Earth. This interconnectedness extends beyond individual ecosystems to encompass the entire planet. The patient work of deep sediment bacteria helps regulate global carbon cycles. The chemical processing performed by hydrothermal vent communities affects ocean chemistry worldwide. The mycorrhizal networks beneath forests influence everything from local weather patterns to the stability of entire watersheds. Life, we discover, is not just something that happens on Earth, it's something that helps create and maintain the conditions that make Earth habitable. In contemplating these vast biological cycles, these ancient partnerships, these patient communities that operate on timescales that dwarf human experience, we find a profound source of comfort and perspective. We are not isolated individuals struggling alone against an indifferent universe. We are participants in biological communities of stunning complexity and resilience, communities that have been billions of years in the making and that continue to evolve and adapt with each passing moment. Every breath you take connects you to photosynthetic organisms around the world. Every meal links you to soil communities that stretch across continents. Your very existence depends on forms of biological cooperation, so fundamental that we usually take them completely for granted. The oxygen in your lungs was created by ancient cyanobacteria that learned to split water molecules using sunlight. The carbon in your body was cycled through countless organisms over millions of years. You are, quite literally, made of recycled starlight, processed through the patient work of biological communities that operate far below the threshold of ordinary perception. This recognition offers more than just scientific insight, it provides a foundation for a different way of being in the world. When we understand ourselves as participants in these vast networks of mutual support, competition gives way to collaboration, anxiety transforms into patience, and the hurried pace of modern life finds balance in the deeper rhythms that have sustained Earth's biosphere for billions of years. The plants that photosynthesize in darkness teach us that scarcity can become abundance when approached with sufficient creativity and patience. The mycorrhizal networks show us that sharing resources strengthens entire communities. The deep-sea chemosynthetic organisms demonstrate that life can thrive even in conditions that seem utterly hostile, finding energy sources that others cannot detect, and creating beauty in places where beauty seems impossible. These lessons extend far beyond biology into realms that touch on some of our deepest questions about how to live meaningful lives in challenging times. Like the shade-adapted plants that make the most of scattered photons, we can learn to find sustenance in small moments of beauty and connection. Like the mycorrhizal networks that share resources across vast distances, we can cultivate relationships that support not just ourselves, but entire communities. Like the patient bacteria in deep sediments, we can learn to persist through difficult periods by operating at sustainable rates rather than burning ourselves out in unsustainable bursts of activity. In the end, the story of photosynthesis without sunlight is really a story about life's extraordinary capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and patient persistence. It's a tale that unfolds not in the bright, obvious places where we expect to find answers, but in the margins, the shadows, the seemingly impossible environments where life has learned to make do with less, to collaborate rather than compete, and to find abundance in conditions that most of us would consider barren. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift towards sleep, carry with you this vision of a living world far more creative and generous than we often realize. Picture the vast mycorrhizal networks stretching beneath your feet, the patient bacteria processing nutrients in distant ocean sediments, the ghostly tube worms dancing around hydrothermal vents in the crushing darkness of the deep sea. All of these communities are conducting their quiet work right now, maintaining the biological cycles that make your existence possible. In their patient example, in their generous sharing of resources, in their ability to find energy and beauty in the most unexpected places, these remarkable organisms offer us a model for resilience that transcends any individual challenge we might face. They remind us that some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, out of sight, conducted by communities whose existence most of us will never directly encounter, but whose activities make all other life possible. So rest well tonight, knowing that you are part of something far larger and more ancient than your individual concerns. You are connected to biological networks that stretch across continents and through geological time, networks that have weathered every catastrophe our planet has ever faced and emerged stronger, more diverse, more beautifully adapted to the challenges of existence. The story of photosynthesis in the dark is still being written in laboratories and forest floors, in deep ocean trenches and mycorrhizal networks, in the patient work of researchers who spend their lives studying organisms most of us will never see. Each discovery adds new chapters to our understanding of life's possibilities, expanding the boundaries of what we consider possible, and reminding us that the universe is far more generous with the gift of existence than we often dare to believe. And perhaps that's the most soothing lesson of all, that life finds a way, not just in the bright, obvious places where we expect it, but in the hidden corners, the forgotten spaces, the seemingly impossible environments where patient organisms have learned to thrive. In their quiet success, in their remarkable adaptations, in their generous sharing of the sun's energy, even in the deepest shadows, we find proof that the boundaries of possibility are far wider than they appear from our limited perspective. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller. May your rest be as deep and peaceful as the ancient forests where ghost pipes bloom, as patient as the bacteria processing nutrients in ocean sediments, and as connected to the vast web of life that sustains us all. In the darkness of sleep, as in the darkness of deep seas and forest floors, remarkable things are quietly unfolding, dreams and metabolisms, memories and chemical reactions, all part of the same grand conversation between matter and energy that we call life. Sleep well, and remember, even in the darkest places, life finds a way to create light.